You're in the information age, but facts are in short supply. Reject the noise, ask bold questions, and seek the truth with FBI whistleblower and common sense extremist, Steve Friend. This is the American Radicals Podcast.
It is the American Radicals Podcast. It's Friday, March 13th, 2026. It's Friday the 13th of the second straight month. So maybe people are out there looking forward to watching some horror movies tonight. Not really my cup of tea, but I'm going to be talking about some stuff that's kind of scary if you like to pay attention to what's going on in the world outside of dropping warheads on foreheads. So today we're going to cover down on the United States borrowing about $7 billion a day. There's some investigations going on at the Department of Homeland Security as to Kristi Noem's spending. The Department of War is spending a lot of money on war and also fruit baskets. Food stamp recipients are suing because they can't access soda anymore. And then a couple of landowners are rejecting generational wealth from big tech. So let's get after it. I am hardly an economics professor. I'm not going to try to be one. In fact, I found one to kick us off today. I want to play a video before we get into the news stories that I want to cover down on today on the AmRad Pot. And it's an oldie, comes from Milton Friedman, and he does a really good job over about a minute and a half of explaining how you can spend money. And there's 4 very specific ways of doing it. And without giving too much buildup, because after all, he is the professor, let's just let him educate us.
You can spend your own money on yourself. And when you spend your own money on yourself, you're very careful of what you spend it on, and you make sure that you get the most for your dollar. You can spend your own money on somebody else. You give gifts to other people. You take people out to dinner. And when you spend your own money on somebody else, you're very careful that you don't spend too much. You try to keep down the amount you spend. But you don't worry very much about what the other fellow's getting from it. You don't pay anything like as much attention to the gifts you buy for other people as to the things you buy for yourself. Or you can spend somebody else's money, as when you're spending the government's money. I say the government's money, the taxpayers' money, which the government has control over. Now you're spending somebody else's money. Let's say you're spending your boss's money. You're out to lunch on a expense account, but you're spending it on yourself. You're very careful that you get good things for your money. You try to have a good lunch and pick the right things, but you're not very much worried about whether you get the cheapest. Spend all you want, and you'll be careless. Now, what happens when you spend somebody else's money on somebody else? You're a distributor of welfare funds. Well, you're interested in making your own life as good as you can, and most people have humane instincts and want to do the best they can, but you're not going to be anything like as careful in spending somebody else's money on somebody else. So there are 4 ways in which you can spend money.
All right. I can't do any better than that. 4 ways to spend money, and he worked through the progressive steps of how you would be most careful to how you would be least careful. And I think what I want to center around today is on the 4th category, spending other people's money on other people, because the government, and he kind of stumbled over his words there. He said the government has control over the money. You mean it taxes it or steals it from you via taxation, or just prints it out of thin air to inflate the currency to make the dollars in your bank account become worth less and worth less until they become worthless, in effect stealing your wealth? That 4th category. Well, how are we doing on that front nowadays? We're spending more than ever, spending other people's money on other people, because if you're a distant bureaucrat in an ivory city in Washington, D.C., it's not your money. You're not really all that concerned about where it came from and where it's going, as long as you can punch the clock and then you can get your money, which the Eagle craps in your bank account every 2 weeks if you work for the federal government. So from Fortune the following story. Quote, "This cannot be sustainable. The U.S. borrowed $50 billion a week for the past 5 months, according to the Congressional Budget Office." And I'm sure at some point in the story, they will make sure to say that it's a nonpartisan office, that they love to throw that out there. It's an element of the government that essentially scores what the government gives it to score, and the government normally gives it things that it wants scored in a positive way. So hardly a nonpartisan actor in this. But $50 billion a month. I'm sorry, a week. That's roughly $7 billion a day. We borrowed $308 billion last month, which would be more than $10 billion a day. Of course, with more borrowing comes higher interests, because what is interest after all? Interest is the cost of borrowing money. Now, if you're a reliable borrower, let's say that you borrow money, you have a credit card, that's basically a short-term loan. You use that credit card and then you pay it back. Well, it could be a low interest because you're reliable. That company knows that you're reliably going to pay that money back, so your cost of borrowing that money will not be very high. Somebody else who doesn't pay their credit card bills off, well, their interest rates will be higher. They're less reliable. Well, how's the American government doing on that front? Well, one element of being able to pay back your debt is just how much debt you actually have. The more that you owe, the less likely you are to pay it off. One, because you're showing and demonstrating how you aren't paying it off. And two, there's a finite amount of resources out there. There's only so much money coming in when you get that paycheck. It can only go to certain routes, and eventually you just run out of coin to distribute out there to pay off. Have you ever been in a tight spot? Have you ever had lots of bills coming in and you look at your bank stub and you see, all right, I only got $1,000. I owe $1,500. Who am I paying first? Because you have to triage that. Well, the United States is sort of in that situation right now. We owe close to $40 trillion. So we've accrued a lot, and there's only so much money that's out there circulating that the government's able to tax from you or print out of thin air. In fact, the expense for us right now as a country is $1 trillion a year in interest. That's money that you pay because you're a citizen, so you have it stolen from you, taxed by your government to pay for things that the government already bought. And it's not even like an asset you can enjoy right now. Do you have a mortgage? Well, you're living in the house. You don't own it. You're paying it off. You're paying interest, but you're still enjoying the accoutrements of living in that house right now. The interest that you pay, you kind of look at as an opportunity. It says, hey, I'm going to have the house now, as opposed to getting a giant pile of money and buying this house in 10, 15, or 30 years. So you get the house now. You're currently living in the house and enjoying it. Government doesn't have that. The government's paying debts not for houses that we're living in, but for things that it already spent, for welfare that it already doled out. It would be like you paying interest to a credit card company because you used your credit card to go out last week and buy a hamburger. You already ate the burger. It's already gone. So paying interest on it now hurts so much because there's nothing to look forward to. Now, the government has some compounding factors under the current presidential administration. Donald Trump's a protectionist. He believes in tariffs. I'm not here to debate free trade or fair trade, but the government's taken in more money via tariffs than it has in a long time. So theoretically, there should be more cash available. They should be paying down some of this debt, or at least not taking on more debt. Oh, and on top of that, they're stealing more of your money. Taxing more of your money. In fact, it looks like through income taxes alone in the last year, your government has stolen an additional $130 billion from you. So bringing in a ton more coin, and yet our debt goes up and up, which can only mean that they're spending more and more and more. And they are. We've never spent more as a country, which is why this is one of the greatest threats to our national security. It's not Iran. It's not ISIS. Shoot. It's not China. Well, China sort of, because they own so much of our debt. Eventually, you just run out of money and collapse. And I'm an American. I'm an American male, right? I have to think of the Roman Empire at least once a week. What were one of the causes that that empire collapsed? Just crippling, crushing debt. That is, in effect, one of the greatest threats to our national security. But there are others out there, which is why we do have a Department of Homeland Security. Certainly nothing about the mission creep and the ever growing bureaucracy that is our federal government, the behemoth it exists to be at this point. The Department of Homeland Security that George Washington stood up, or wait, no, it was George Bush after September 11th. But I got a couple pieces about that I want to get to. This one comes from Real Clear Politics. It's from Susan Crabtree, and it's an interesting piece about the Inspector General, which is supposed to be having oversight of the Department of Homeland Security. Every agency has its own Inspector General, its own watchdog, as they like to call it. But in effect, Inspector Generals are basically the government investigating the government and then determining that the government didn't do anything wrong. But according to Susan Crabtree here, at least it looks like the Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security is trying a good faith effort to investigate what the heck was going on when Kristi Noem was at the helm of the Department of Homeland Security. And they had a lot of problems. There was actually a lot of pushback from Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski and other leaders, because the Inspector General is supposed to operate quasi-independently, to just bring forward a judicious investigation into certain allegations of fraud, waste, and abuse. But what happened? According to this piece over at Real Clear Politics, Kristi Noem, Corey Lewandowski blocked the Inspector General from getting critical information. So the whole genesis of the allegation against Noem specifically is that she steered over $200 million to 3 different companies so that they could run advertisements. Those advertisements were on their face supposed to be to tell illegal aliens not to come to the United States of America and what would happen to them. But in effect, what were they? They were a hype campaign for Kristi Noem, who wants to run for president. One of the giant mandates that the American people set in November of 2024 was, we want mass deportations. This was Kristi Noem's opportunity because she got snubbed on the vice president pick. She could be at the helm of the cabinet position that was in charge of those mass deportations. This was her chance to launch herself into the stratosphere, running for president in 2028. And on top of that, also enrich your personal friends. So of the $220 million, it looks like around 2/3 of that went to the husband of one of her friends. And that guy started his company like a week and a half before the $200 million was doled out. So looks like a lot of corruption. I don't know if it's illegal. It certainly is corrupt. And it's one of the reasons that Kristi Noem is no longer the Secretary of Homeland Security. But the Inspector General is supposed to be investigating that. And they were stymied by Kristi Noem. Shocker. She didn't want the corruption to come out. They're also stymied on some other things too, because ICE, Immigration's Customs Enforcement, has stopped the Inspector General over at the Department of Homeland Security from accessing certain databases that they were privy to for a long time. Customs and Border Protection has stopped Inspector General from looking at data warehouses that have all the information about the border crossings that are or aren't happening. So now it has me at least questioning that whole fact that we got the border crossings are 0. The Inspector General for Department of Homeland Security can't verify that. The independent auditor can't get access to the information. So we just have to take the government's word for it. Not that I take the government watchdog's word for it very much more, but there's certainly an impasse there. And why is that happening? And then the last thing that came out of this piece, again, from Real Clear Politics, Susan Crabtree, was that the Inspector General, I said, operates quasi independently, because really at the end of the day, the law says that they have to be responsive somewhat to the secretary of their respective department. So Kristi Noem sort of is in control. And in order to stymie these investigations that the Inspector General was trying, it was alluded to at the Inspector General that Kristi Noem wanted to get a full audit of every case that they had. And just, we just want to remind you, if we don't like it, we have the ability to shut those down. So a question of independence there from an agency that is $300+ billion of your money every single year. And That money, again, is borrowed. We're paying interest on it. And really, what is the purpose of the Department of Homeland Security? What's it supposed to be doing? Protecting us from terrorist attacks. That's why we stood it up. Post 9/11, the federal government said, no American can ever die from a terrorist attack again. That is the mission of national security. So we need a brand new agency in order to do that. But what is the threat condition right now? We cover down on FBI entrapment playbook cases all the time because 90+% of counterterrorism investigations at the behest of the Federal Bureau of Investigation involve somebody who's not predisposed or capable of doing a terrorism, but for the involvement of the government. They set up the patsy like a bowling pin so they can knock them on down and remind you just how awesome they are. DHS is supposed to do the same thing. What does the threat landscape look like right now? So just briefly, the president, he would be getting those daily briefings, right? What does he think the threats are? We're dropping warheads on foreheads in Iran. Iran is supposed to be the largest and worst state sponsor of terror on the planet in the history since Charlemagne roamed the earth. Well, according to Donald Trump, he's not worried about any domestic terrorist attack. So a quotation that Donald Trump gave said that he's not worried and, quote, no, I don't think that there's going to be a retaliation. And right now, quote, they've lost their Navy, their Air Force. They have no anti-aircraft apparatus at all. Their leaders are gone, and we could do a lot worse. So why are we putting $300 billion in the Department of Homeland Security? Let alone the $11 billion that the FBI gets, when I would argue that the majority of the spending that they do over there is for national security purposes, not criminal matters. And how much do we give to the FBI? Say that number all the time, right? $11 billion, and 90% of its terrorism cases are basically fake. And a huge percent of its criminal cases are just cases that local police officers worked and got an arrest, and then the FBI swoops in when all the danger's gone so they can steal credit, right? What are we really getting the bang for our buck? $11 billion. Could that money be spent somewhere else? I mean, the cupboards are getting barer. We're having to pay more and more in interest because we have to borrow more and more money to pay the interest, let alone the other functions of our government. But $11 billion, that number kind of hits me in the feels. So when I see it, it just kind of sticks out to me. $11 billion. Did you know that we've spent $11 billion in Iran in 6 days? The entire budget for the Federal Bureau of Investigation is estimated to what we spent in Iran in less than a week of the kinetic operation campaign going on there. Totally not a war. How dare you call me stewardess? I'm a flight progress coordinator. This comes from NBC. The estimate did not include some of the costs associated with the operation, like the buildup of military hardware and moving personnel. I mean, those things are totally free, right? So actually, the expectation is that this estimate of $11 billion in 6 days is an underestimate. So we spent more than that. But, if we're actually getting rid of the threat, why don't we just ditch the FBI and shift that money over? The federal government's essentially a giant pair of cargo pants, one pocket to another. It's all on the same body, right? I mean, I'd be on board for that, mostly because I hate the FBI director. I think he's kind of a douchebag, and I'd like to see Kash Patel out of work. But if we did that, if we moved $11 billion from FBI Director Kash over to the Department of War, Department of Defense, I get confused because I guess the Trump administration wants to call it Department of War and the media says it's not. I don't know if it takes an act of Congress or not. Whatever. That's why they always call it the Pentagon, and even sometimes they're throwing out DOD still. But is the Department of War a good steward of our money? Certainly, Donald Trump wants to give them a 50% boost in spending next year, going from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. But what are they doing with the money? Well, it came up on the end of the year, and they didn't buy a whole lot of warheads to drop on foreheads. Instead, it looked like they spent a lot of money on furniture and fruit baskets. So this comes from the New Republic, which is not a right-leaning source, but they do have actual information in here, actual facts and figures, and that's what I'm all about. So let me just run through some of the expenses that came out of September 2025, the last month of the fiscal year, because the federal government's fiscal year begins October 1st. So unlike the rest of us, where our calendar ends in December 31st. The federal government ends September 30th. Got to spend that money, right? If you don't use it, you'll lose it. I'll give you some examples from my personal life in a moment. But here's what the Department of War / Department of Defense saw fit to spend in the final month of fiscal year of 2025. About $100,000 on a grand piano for the Air Force Chief of Staff's home. $5.3 million for Apple devices. $2 million on Alaskan king crab. $7 million on lobster tail. $15 million for ribeye steak. $124,000 for ice cream machines. $225 million on furniture. $140,000 on donuts. It was 272 orders. And then we have $12,000 for fruit baskets and $60,000 for fancy luxury reclining chairs. You don't use it, you lose it. And we do not want to lose it if we're the Department of Defense / War. In fact, we want a 50% increase in our budget. And when we don't spend all that, we're definitely going to have to spend it. Otherwise, we'll lose that, right? The stories that come out of if you don't use it, you lose it, are utterly disgusting. It makes your government look like drunken frat boys who are living on mommy and daddy's dime. Trust fund babies. They just do not care. In fact, you're incentivized to spend the money. So I have it right here on my desk. Let me pull this up. This is a pocket knife for those watching on rumble.com/amradpod, YouTube @amradpod, or later on Spotify, amradpod. Pull it up. We're like 20, 21 minutes into the episode. Holding it in my hand, this is a pocket knife. Didn't buy it. The federal government bought it. You bought it. It's a SOG pocket knife with Digicam coloring. And I've had it for 6 or 7 years. I don't know if I've ever used it to do anything other than open an envelope. You see the blade? There it is. It cost you, the taxpayer, about $300 because we had end of the year funds. And I worked on an Indian reservation and I said, hey, can I get a Leatherman? Can I get a pocket knife? It would be useful to me. I had an old pocket knife at the time, still did the trick, but I was told we have to spend the money. And they laughed when I said I wanted a pocket knife because it wasn't expensive enough. They said, yeah, sure, we'll get you the most expensive one because we have to spend the money or we lose it. Now, come on, Steve, $300. We're talking about a $7 trillion government. Really, that's not even a drop in the ocean. Okay. What about the four-wheeler that my office of 5 people wound up getting? A four-wheeler. Why did we get a four-wheeler? Because there was a dead body on an Indian reservation that a four-wheeler was used in order to access the dead body. The four-wheeler was not the federal government's. It was actually a vehicle that was owned by a Native American tribe because they had four-wheelers and they allowed us to use them. But the FBI wanted its own four-wheeler. So for $35,000, then you toss in a nice trailer. Now you're over $40,000 and a memorandum of understanding where to park it because we worked in a bank building that didn't have an enclosure. We had to draft a memorandum of understanding with the Department of the Drug Enforcement Agency that was nearby where they would stow the four-wheeler. A Polaris Razor arrived at our office because it was the end of the year funds and we had to spend the money. On the kicker, the reason that we became aware of the money was because one of the agents in my office traveled to Washington, D.C. area for some training. And while he was there, interacted with the headquarters person who said, hey, I got this giant pool of money. We got to spend it. And you guys are on the hook. You can spend this money. This is excess funds that I found in another one of the cargo pants pockets. So this agent came back, let the boss know, hey, there's extra money we can spend. And the boss was so ecstatic that we found extra money to just dump that she gave him a bonus, $1,000. Well done, good and faithful servant. You got points like you're a mafia don? Yep, you paid it, America. That's the Department of Defense. And I know that stuff is legion within the federal government, but certainly spending millions of dollars on lobster tail is a little bit off-putting, we'll say, suboptimal. But here's something else that's quite suboptimal and makes our Department of War / Defense look really unprofessional. And that is the following. Donald Trump just appointed Erica Kirk to the Air Force Academy board. Reasons unknown to me, other than, he likes her. Charlie Kirk apparently was on the board and did one meeting before he was assassinated. And because she took over Turning Points USA, that qualifies her to determine what does the board do at the Air Force Academy? As a Board of Visitors member, Erica Kirk is one of 16 members responsible for making recommendations to the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who loves himself some lobster tail, about changes to the Air Force Academy. That would include curriculum and architecture and quality of life, all this other stuff. Who else is on this? There's a congressman named Jeff Crank, who's a radio host. And there's Tommy Tuberville, a football coach. One guy, August Pfluger, he's a 20-year Air Force vet, also an alum of the Air Force Academy. So at least it's not a total bleep show over there. That guy actually might know a thing or two about the Air Force, about the Air Force Academy, might be able to give some substantive recommendations to the Department of Defense / war boss, his secretary, Hegseth. But what sort of resources are being spent on that? I mean, are they flying Erica Kirk out to Colorado Springs to go and have meetings once a month or once a quarter? That doesn't seem like very good stewardship. What sort of recommendations could they achieve there? Could it be achieved on a Zoom call? And why do we need input from a radio host or a football coach or a wife of a grassroots activist / podcaster? Definitely not serious. Seems like it's an intellectually barren landscape there when it comes to making recommendations, with the exception of that one guy, Pfluger. Cupboards are bare. All right. Now, talking about the economics of our government just wasting money every single moment that we're alive, what could be some of the downstream consequences of that? And is it a problem that's being compounded by the actions of the government, maybe in a good faith effort to help people? So I've got a couple pieces here about SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps. First one comes from NPR, and they love themselves the histrionics, the atmospherics, and the sob story. Headline, out of work and with 2 teens, this mom may lose food stamps under Trump's changes. Donald Trump, mean, orange, literally Hitler, is now stealing money from this mom who they used to profile. Her name is Mara, but she asked for her last name to be withheld because of the stigma tied to receiving government assistance. Yeah, that's right, Mara. You got that message across, but you still want to get them. How badly does she want to get them? And what are these changes? So there are now some new work requirements for people who receive food stamps. Previously, if you got food stamps and you had children under 18, you didn't have to do the work requirements. That said, you either had to work, you had to volunteer, you had to do some training. It had to add up to 80 hours a month. So like 20 hours a week, at least be trying to make your life better economically without the assistance of the government. But the one big, beautiful bill wound up raising the standards, lowering the age. So instead of, hey, you got kids who are under the age of 18, you can stay at home and just get food stamps. They're saying if the kids are under the age of 14, meaning that they would be high school aged, so they're still living at home, not theoretically an adult. That's going to put a more of an onus on people to go try to find some work, at least apply to find some work, even volunteer, do some training in a half of a work week capacity, 20 hours. And that is a burden on this woman who realizes that what she's doing, there's a stigma attached to it. It's a burden that she can't shoulder. But it's not a burden that should catch her by surprise, because the one big, beautiful bill was passed a while back. So it's hardly new information. And it's hardly something that went into effect immediately. So this Mara, who's got kids that are high school age, under 18, over 14, she's going to have to put in some time looking for a job. The timeline for her, because she lives in Minnesota, communist enclave that it is, she's able to continue receiving her SNAP benefits up through this month until April 1st. She lost her job in August of last year. So you're talking that she's had an 8-month runway. Oh, it was actually a longer runway that, because the job that she had was only part-time and she was full-time living on food stamps. Now, she complains that she didn't make a living wage as a part-time work. Part-time is not supposed to be a living wage regardless of how much you make. I guess unless you're, an Air Force Academy Board of Trustees member and they're paying you a government salary in order to meet 3 times a year. But by and large, if you work part-time, the expectation is that's supplemental income. That's not something that's going to sustain a single mother and 2 teenagers. But why is she needing food stamps to begin with? And back to the dog chasing its tail, the death spiral that is the government spending. When your government spends so much money on things that it's not supposed to be involved in, things that are not part of our pesky, dusty documents, coin money, sign some treaties, protect the border, protect against fraud and force. That's it. But when you get in the business of food or childcare or healthcare, or telecommunications, or energy, or land management, what have you, that costs money. That ain't free. And every time you incur more of an expense and you create another bureaucracy, which goal should be to fix a problem, but it's really not. As a government bureaucracy, you never want to work yourself out of a job. Your goal is inverse to that. You don't want to have no job. You want to have more of a job because then you can get more funding that you have to spend by September 30th every single fiscal year. Otherwise, you don't get it next year. And in order to sustain that, the government has to steal money, tax it from the people, making them poorer, or inflate their currency, again, making them poorer, which would necessitate more people having to either work more or get on the government dole. You get more people on the government dole, it's more of a drain on the system. We have to add to the system, which in effect causes the government to then go out and either print more money or steal more money from the citizenry, making more of the people dependent on the government. You see how it's sort of a death spiral, and it's being done maybe not out of nefarious reasons. It might just be a Milton Friedman move, where it's people spending other people's money on other people and not being really good particular stewards of it. It's easily explainable. But at the same time, this is a condition that has been caused by the government getting involved to begin with. I don't think Mara would need to be on food stamps if we had economic conditions that were not strained to the point where our government was spending $1 trillion a year on interest on cheeseburgers that you ate last week and you're paying your credit card bills. That's created a very tense and dynamic in a workplace where the margins are very thin, the costs are very high, and there's going to be professional layoffs like Mara experienced 8 months ago. But let's say she actually tiptoes through the raindrops and she gets some sort of an exemption. She gets those food stamps. It's supposed to be temporary, but we all know that a lot of people stay on them for an extended period of time. What are food stamps supposed to do? Supplemental. You take a vitamin, you don't just eat a Flintstones vitamin and say, I'm done for the day. It's a supplement. It's filling in the gaps that maybe, you didn't get all your vitamin C that you needed to stay healthy. So we're just going to take this to supplement it. Well, is Mountain Dew something that you should have in your diet? Like, how about Coca-Cola? How about 5-Hour Energy? No, which is why there was a push relatively recently to remove the sugary drinks from the SNAP benefit, what you can actually spend it on. And now there's a lawsuit by the Mara types of the world, people who are on food stamps, who are trying to, hashtag resist the president because he's mean, orange, and literally Hitler, and they don't like RFK Jr., who doesn't like sugary drinks. So from the New York Times to our next piece, at one point, a newspaper reports about this. Headline, food stamp recipients sue over bans on sugary drinks. This is a legitimate effort by people in front of a judge to argue that they're entitled to take your money as a taxpayer that was stolen from you, taxed, in order to use it on Mountain Dew Code Red. Now, since May, there's been 22 states that barred SNAP participants from using their bennies to go and buy energy drinks and candy and soda and prepare desserts. So I guess like ho-hos and yodels and Twinkies. There are 5 plaintiffs who have joined forces together like Captain Planet. When your powers combine, you too can try to hashtag resist the mean, orange, literally Hitler president. The lawsuit argues that the Trump administration had no authority because SNAP allows for pilot projects that test ways to improve efficiency and delivery, but you can't just disallow food. And also, the Department of Agriculture failed to provide notice and options for the public to comment about how they wanted to buy Twinkies and Yodels, and that violated the Administrative Procedures Act. Administrative Procedures Act. Where does that come from? That's the thing from the 40s where the Congress said legislating is too darn hard. So we're going to authorize the executive branch in contravention to our pesky, dusty documents to just pass rules, and those rules will have the force of law. You know what? Article 2 powers, you handle everything. I'm too busy going out fundraising, trying to get reelected, and drafting legislation that is overly broad, non-specific, so that if something goes wrong, I could say, hey, look, I just passed the legislation that said that the Environmental Protection Agency shall have authority to regulate waterways. It's not my fault that they went into your backyard and said that that puddle is a navigable waterway, and now they're going to fine you or put you in jail. Don't blame me. By the way, have you chipped in $5 to my campaign? The Administrative Procedures Act is one of the most detrimental laws that has ever passed, at least in the last 100 years, in this country. And because the Trump administration is violating this law that is a net negative for the country in order to do something that is economically good and from a health perspective positive, there's a lawsuit in place by a bunch of 400-pound people on SNAP benefits. Now, who's standing up this lawsuit? The organization that's doing it is called National Center for Law and Economic Justice. And just, me saying that, you know what it is. It's a bunch of communists. And just on my own initiative, I went to just make sure. And at their website, they talk about things about low-wage workers and how people who don't earn enough money are largely minorities and women, because if the meteor strikes Earth tomorrow, women and minorities will be hurt worst. And also people are incarcerated more often because they're tan. So dyed-in-the-wool communist organization that brings in about $2 million a year in donations in order to bring these ridiculous lawsuits on behalf of people who are getting food stamps. But ultimately, I think that this is a convenient outlet for this organization. Again, this organization called National Center for Law and Economic Justice. But who would I really bet is on this? It's the soda companies and the candy companies and the cookie companies and the hostess of the world. Because what are food stamps? Food stamps are a government welfare system in which people who pay taxes have their money stolen, tax, by the government, and have it redistributed to other people from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. That money gets distributed to the poor from the middle and the upper class. And then the poor people go out and spend it on Mountain Dew, Code Red, and Yodels, which are made by big, giant corporations that have all these different relationships with politicians. So the government is stealing money from the middle class to give it to the poor, who then turn right around and give it back to giant corporations because of a gross symbiotic relationship between the government and those giant corporations. So the middle class gets squeezed, the upper class is good, lower class is better, and that sounds like socialism / fascism, the worst possible combination. But don't worry. I know the cupboards are bare. I know you're struggling, but those upper class people, the people who work for Coca-Cola corporations or Mars or Hershey, whoever is putting out this junk food that the welfare recipients feel entitled to have and are going to force you at the tip of the gun, good luck not paying your taxes, to give them your money so that they can go out and buy it. Maybe the upper class can just live a little bit higher on the hog. So much so that they have oodles of money that they can spend on their poodles. Oodles for their poodles from the New York Times, at one point a newspaper. Track with me here, guys. Headline: a $1,000 dog grooming session. The pet wellness industry is booming. Americans are increasingly lonely and isolated, relying on their pets for emotional support. They're also more likely to view them as a family member and willing to spend more on them. Guys, the New York Times interviewed 50 pet owners for this article. NPR interviewed one food stamp recipient for the last piece. 50 pet owners jumped forward to talk to the New York Times about how much they love the fur babies. And if you happen to be watching this, you see this dude who's got 4, what was it, like Yorkies or something? Oh, they're Norwich Terriers. His name is Sam Chow. He lives in Manhattan. He calls his 4 dogs his kids because he's got great priorities. And you notice there's no wedding ring on that finger. He spends about $3,000 on specialty work and $11,000 on grooming every single year. So over $1,000 a month to groom his dogs. Some other examples, because they did interview 50 people, just how absurd it got. A woman named Ruth Zaplin lives in Washington, D.C., another high net worth area. Well, why are all you people here? Well, because all the money's there. You steal it, tax it from Americans so you can spend it on yourselves. She lives in Washington. She spends $500 to $700 every month to get her 1-year-old poodle Jasper groomed. His haircuts cost more than mine, she said. Gag. Kill yourself. I can't. I realize I'm in the vast minority. This hits me hard because dogs aren't people. They're wild animals that you just happen to have in your house. I understand I'm an extremist on this one, but I think I can pull a lot of people to my side when I'm seeing people spend thousands of dollars on doing blueberry face masks. Yes, they're detailed here in the New York Times on their dogs to rejuvenate their skin. Jasper's last appointment took 10 hours. Also, there's a woman out there, and good on her. She's at least entrepreneurial. She's training people who were like the rest of us, possibly, maybe, inclined to spend some money on your dog, but not that much. And saying, hey, I'm buying yellow tag beef. Cujo up there, he's not getting the blueberry face mask. How do I cut his own hair? So this woman, her name is Lucia. She does a 5-hour course that you can pay $500, $100 an hour, in order to learn how to cut your dog's hair so that you don't have to come to her or her type anymore, spend $1,000 in order to get a grooming done. This is the haves and the have-nots. The cupboards are bare for significant portions of this country. And then you have others who are out there just living it up. And the class warfare is rampant. You're going to see this where one group gets pitted against another in electoral politics. And my fear is that it's actually going to get a lot worse than that. Now, this is pretty dark stuff, but I do have a positive story I want to close it out with on the AMRAD pod today on. And it just really a story about iron will and tip of the cap to 2 women who are standing and holding the line when it comes to refusing generational wealth on principle and because they just want to say, get off my damn lawn. So let's give this video a play and give you a little bit more context for it in a moment.
Talks about a data center here in Mason County have been ongoing since last spring. This is the home of Ida Huddleston. She has been offered $60,000 an acre for her land to make way for this project. Her home sits on 71 acres.
And what they proposed and have carried on with us is not a business deal. It's a mind harassment.
Offered millions on multiple occasions. This is Ida's message.
I said, I don't want your money. I don't need your money. But I do feel sorry for everybody around us that they're going to be affected by it.
Same goes for Ida's daughter, Delcia Bear, who turned down a $48,000 an acre offer for her 463-acre property. Particularly frustrating for Bear is the fact that the Fortune 100 company behind the project has not been revealed.
And so when they will not reveal who they are, that's a major player in what you're going to do with the rest of your life if you're stuck here or even if you're leaving here.
The data center would be located here at Big Pond Pike. As Tyler McHugh, Economic Development Director for the Maysville-Mason County Industrial Development Authority, told me in October, it would create 400 full-time positions along with more than 1,500 construction jobs.
Jobs would go, they would become, if not our largest employer, definitely top 3.
Delcia's response?
My guess is you won't have over 50 and they won't even be there at this building when it's said and done.
As for the future, like Delcia, Ida sends a clear message about her plans.
I'm staying put.
Wow. They gave you the price per acre. It's a mother and a daughter, a numbers guy. So mom, Ida, she was offered $60,000 an acre for a 71-acre property. $4.2 million. Daughter, Delcia, $48,000 an acre, 463-acre property, $22.2 million. And they just said, get off my lawn. Generational wealth. They don't believe in it. They don't think it's good business. They don't trust it because the individuals involved won't even identify themselves. And they say, yeah, I smell a rat. I think I want them in charge of the Department of Defense / War or Department of Homeland Security. At least I know we wouldn't be spending millions of dollars on lobster tail or ad campaigns where I get to ride a horse in front of Mount Rushmore. Just regular people who are grossed out and disgusted by corruption and double dealing and just a failure to be able to do a handshake deal with honor. All right, guys, we've reached the end of the American Radicals podcast for today and for this week. But before we send you off into your weekend, I do have a nice, fun palate cleanse. Times are tough. Not everybody's getting $1,000 dog grooming sessions. I know, you go out to the supermarket, you're looking for that yellow tag beef, but we do have maybe a health guru with some good advice that you can take into this weekend when you do your grocery shopping.
Today I'm meal prepping for the next 30 days. This helps keep my diet consistent, and the good thing about hot dogs, they're stacked with amazing nutrients and they're preservatives to make them last a long time. People wonder why I don't use ketchup or mustard, but I don't like eating red 40 or yellow 5. However, from time to time I do add some extra flavor. To make my meals even more convenient, I store them in easy to access areas. For example, I don't even have to take a break from playing games to enjoy my next meal. I do still kind of suck at this game though. This might seem ridiculous, but the reality is I'm 2 months ahead on meals, and I'm not going to need to cook for a very long time.
Hey, what works for some. All right, guys, we'll be back with you Monday noontime here on Rumble and YouTube, and always at Spotify. AmRad Pod is where you go. And until then, have a great weekend.
You've been listening to the American Radicals podcast. Find us on YouTube, Rumble, and X at AmRadPod.